Joining us now is Shane Wright, Senior Economics Correspondent at The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. Shane Wright, couldn't see you there for a moment, but I'm glad you've joined us this morning. Great to see you. Are we headed towards another climate change election, and is it going to work out better for the Labor Party this time?
Oh, look, you start off with the two great questions, don't you? Look, you definitely can see how we could have climate change as a big issue at the next election. Of course, we've got 2 more summers between that one, so whether you want an election campaign all about climate change if you're the government and you've had 2 seasons of terrible fires or anything else, that's one question. If you're the Labor Party, if you can't explain how you're going to get to your 2050 target, that's another, and the scare campaign that you can see Barnaby Joyce and co going on about. Of course, at the heart of this is the IPCC saying if we don't get to net zero emissions by 2050, you and I may as well go home because the world's going to burn up. And this is one of the issues where the science is absolutely clear. International science community is saying you have to get to this point. Labor says that's our target. The government, which has signed up to the IPCC, saying, well, it's terrible, but they've signed up to the target. It's one of the great quandaries of the political cycle at the moment.
Shane, the thread really came loose for the Labor Party in the last election when it couldn't price the effects of climate change, and now that is the argument that the Labor Party is trying to put onto the coalition today by saying, you know, what is the price of inaction? Do you think that this time could be any different?
Well, last election you could price what the impact of not getting on top of climate change, or limiting climate change to 1.5 degrees by 2050. Beyond, if we don't do that, according to the IPCC, you get 2, 3, 4 degrees by the end of the century, and Canberra has seaside property. That's the issue. And so Labor really got hammered in that space, particularly in the coal seats of Queensland, arguing the reverse of, if we don't, do we have to start putting stilts on homes in Dubbo? That's a different way to approach it. Whether you can ask a government or a party to price out how you're going to get to something in 2050. If I go back 30 years, fax machines were just coming into newsrooms. It was fantastic technology. No one had ever thought of the internet or the smartphone. Technology changes dramatically over 30 years. So, like, we've got one side, elements of one side. You've just had Dave Sharma on, for instance, arguing a far more nuanced case. And you've got small group inside the coalition wanting to keep the world in aspic for the next 30 years. That's clearly untenable, and they don't want to argue, well, in 30 years, yeah, they'll be pumping coal out of Queensland. What was it this week? Last week we saw India saying they're not going to accept thermal coal imports from 23, 24. That's really close in terms of what are you going to do in terms of that resources sector. It's
so frustrating, really, because the electoral fortunes and the electoral realities really haven't changed, and they're not going to change between now and the next election. The fact is, Labor needs to win those coal seats in Queensland if it's going to have any chance of being in government once again. How they straddle that, I think they've come out with this target, which is not surprising. They're always going to end up here, but the argument hasn't changed enough to really shift the conversation around these longer-term targets. I mean, for Scott Morrison, you have now a core group in the Nationals Party, or the whole National Party, essentially saying that they are not on board with government policy, which is what Paris was essentially signing up to, these longer-term targets. But you also have the Labor Party on the other side just using these old arguments that essentially failed at the last election. I mean, business is doing a lot of the heavy lifting now anyway. Put a cost on some of these things. Have a real conversation about where coal is going. The market is dictating.
Well, I'm not convinced the argument that if you lose 4 or 5 Queensland coal seats, that's the end of the cycle for the ALP. As I say, you just had Dave Sharma in here. You could lose Higgins, you could lose Kooyong. You can pick up seats around climate change, and you get that net zero. Here we are, net zero by 2022, perhaps, or 2021. the Labor Party might have to make that calculation whether those coal seats will ever come back. Or you're going to have to target, and remember, at the end of the day, elections in this country are won and lost in marginal seats all across suburban areas. Like, we've had this huge focus on Queensland, but if you say, for instance, Labor did not win, won Lindsay rather than lost Lindsay, you're down into, the government's actually down into marginal, not marginal, but it's got a one seat, less than it's got a one seat majority. It becomes very close very quickly. You get to Latrobe in Victoria. You start looking at those other seats, it becomes a different issue very quickly. So, yeah, you've got the National Party who have seemed to have forgotten that they've signed up to this and don't want to talk about what happens in 10 years, 20 years' time if the planet is warming even more quickly than it is, because it's all about the here and now. And whether Labor has got the nous to argue its case a bit better, that's the big issue there.
Shane Wright, economics editor at the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. Appreciate your time this morning. Thank you so much for joining us. Just a very small part of a very big debate that will be taking place.